Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita politics and government affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday morning at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30. Also at the Voice for Liberty, that's wichitaliberty.org, my website. You'll find this episode and all the old episodes there. You'll find show notes for the episodes and then all the other material that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. So today our guest is our Congressman in the United States House of Representatives, Ron Estes. Prior to becoming an elected official, he worked in consulting and management roles in the private sector. He then became Sedgwick County Treasurer, then the state of Kansas Treasurer, and was elected to Congress last year when Mike Pompeo resigned to become Director of the CIA and now Secretary of State. And just celebrated, marked anyway, your 1 year of service. It was April 25th, I think, that it was. So, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV, Congressman Estes.
Thank you, Bob.
So, you noted that you filed for re-election. No surprise, because you told us on this show that you were going to run for re-election. Just as a public service, a couple dates coming up. June 1st is the filing deadline. July 17th is the registration deadline. There's a primary election on August 7th, and the Democrats are going to have. There's two active Democratic candidates, and then in November 6th we have a general election for that, and many other offices, governor, and a lot of other things as well. So, Representative Estes, recently you had an op-ed in the Washington Examiner that raised some concerns about the trade environment, particularly how that affects the 4th District of Kansas with primarily, I think, our aviation industry that exports a lot of stuff, and also we export quite a bit of agricultural products as well.
Right. Trade's very important for not just the 4th District, but all of Kansas and actually all of the country. When we look at over the last several years, we've seen a lot of unfair trade practices, and that's our big push is we should have free and fair trade and need to make sure that when countries aren't participating freely and fairly, that they're called out. And that's what President Trump's doing right now is he's calling out China for some of their unfair practices over the years, dumping products and other things. And so we're in the midst right now of that competitive process back and forth whenever there is a trade dispute. And you typically see two countries, one that makes the accusation of the unfair acts by the other country stands up and says, no, we're not, but if you do, we'll retaliate against you. And they stand toe to toe for a little bit, and then they sit down and do some negotiating or go through mediation. And that's kind of where we are in that process right now. China's started to make those comments that they're ready to move into mediation or a negotiating standpoint. Unfortunately, as you go through that process, you create some turmoil, and that's what we're struggling with right now. We've seen steel prices and aluminum prices go up.
You mentioned two businesses in the area that were consumers of that and how they've seen price increases.
That's right. It affects a lot of our manufacturing companies. You also see agriculture prices drop. Chinese are really playing hardball in this. I mean, they're targeting specific products and actually working to target products from states that were supporters of President Trump. And so they're targeting soybeans and grain sorghum here in Kansas, and we've seen some drop in those prices. We need to get through this. Had the opportunity a couple weeks ago to meet with Larry Kudlow, who's the new economic advisor for the president, and he talked about he knows the pain we're going through right now. He wants a latitude of a couple of months to actually get through that negotiating process, to get that process moving forward, and ideally get the Chinese government and the companies they control to actually go address and make sure they're executing with free and fair trade.
Notice you also mentioned that intellectual property theft in your op-ed too. People may not understand that. Can you explain a little bit? That's computer software, isn't it, that they're stealing?
Well, it's computer software, but it could also be the design for a new technology, design for a new product, a new motor, a new engine, a new switch panel, or any type of product. And we've seen over the years that there have been several cases that Chinese have gone and basically pirated U.S. design and then turned around and copied that, sent that to the United States as a product of their own, and tried to make money off of that. And that's not fair to American companies who actually go through the work, do the research and development, and then market that, own that patent. So we want to make sure that gets addressed as well. Now, the best way of this isn't to do tariffs. Now, that's been the thing that we've talked about. Tariffs don't provide free and fair trade, but we want to make sure that if there are tariffs because somebody's dumping a product, a country's dumping a product, that it's targeted towards that country and those particular products.
Carl, I can see you've got a question, but we are going to take a commercial break right here, so we'll be back again in just a moment. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Carl Peter John, United States Congressman Ron Estes of the 4th District here, talking about the importance of trade at the moment. Carl?
Congressman, we've talked a little bit about China in the last segment, but NAFTA's been on the table. A bigger issue, in addition to NAFTA, has been how the whole procedure for the World Trade Organization in terms of negotiating and mediation on this. There's been a lot of talk that it's not fair to the United States and that the system's broken. What's number one in terms of trade? China, NAFTA reauthorization, or the whole process for how we adjudicate trade disputes?
I think from the country standpoint, in terms of what we're working at now, I'd probably say there's two number ones. It's NAFTA and working through with China. Ultimately, working through the World Trade Organization and the entire process takes a little bit longer to get through because you have a lot more countries involved, a lot more things to deal with from that standpoint. But as we talked about, China and typically dumping products that come from a country, you want to make sure that's addressed. And normally that's defined under the WTO rules, so you want to make sure that those rules ultimately get fairly defined and fairly revised. Same thing with that.
Well, let me ask then, in terms of if equally important as NAFTA, do you support renegotiation of NAFTA?
Right. NAFTA's 25 years old right now. And you think about what things were like 25 years ago from a standpoint of technology in the world or businesses and the way things were operating. So it is time to modernize it. President Trump during the campaign used some unfortunate words in terms of just tearing up the contract and tearing up the agreement. And that's not what we can do. We need to have that agreement. It's worked very well for a lot of Kansas companies, a lot of Kansas agriculture products. And NAFTA is a good trading arrangement between our three countries here in North America. But there are some things that need to be updated on it. And particularly we're looking, and they made great progress. There's only a couple of the sections that are still left to be addressed. One of them deals with dairy products in Canada. Back when this was processed, there weren't a lot of dehydrated and dry milk products that were produced, and the Canada companies were able to get the provisions that worked for them. And now that there's much more demand on a worldwide basis, that's one of those things that needs to be addressed and resolved.
Let me ask you a broader economic question, because we've focused on trade so far, but the overall economy, we've got record low unemployment, we've had a very strong stock market, we've got a whole bunch of positive economic indicators in terms of growth. This doesn't make the news. Why not? And what's the rest of the story on the economy that isn't getting out there?
Yeah, you're right, it doesn't make the news. I mean, the mainstream media really supports the Democrat agenda. They support the messaging that they want to have that criticizes the president, keeps the president from getting his job done. But we're seeing a lot of positive things. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was implemented, along with some of the regulatory reform that the president and Congress has passed last year, we're seeing economic growth that's going from right around 2% during the Obama administration up to 3%. Which means more jobs, more companies expanding, actually more tax revenue for the government as well because of that. One of the things that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was criticized by the Democrats was that it actually would, if you just crunch the numbers purely as they stood, it would have $1.5 trillion less in tax receipts. but that's the way the Congressional Budget Office does their calculations. They use a static model. They basically say, okay, if you drop tax rates from 39.6% to 25%, this is the change of that amount of income. What they don't take into account is people's behavior. That if you have more money in your pocket, you're going to go out to dinner more often. You're going to go out and look and buy your teenage child a second car instead of sharing the car you have. And just last month, I saw that the economic forecast for the next 10 years has been raised by over $500 billion. So already 6 months into the tax cuts, we're seeing a third of that quote unquote loss, the way the CBO had calculated, is being recovered and been revised.
Democrats have criticized it as saying, hey, there's temporary tax cuts for just crumbs, I think was the word, for little people, but there hasn't been, the benefits went to the rich. How would you address that?
Yeah, I don't know the way Nancy Pelosi thinks, because she does think some weird things, and one of her comments was it's crumbs for the tax cuts. But the average Kansan family of four is going to get over $2,200 back in reduction in their taxes, between the rates being lowered, between the increase in child tax credit, and a credit for each parent as well included in that. And we've almost doubled the standard deduction. So a lot of people who had to itemize in the past will be able to take the standard deduction, make it more simpler to do their tax returns. So, I don't know how Nancy views things in San Francisco, but here in Kansas, $2,200 is a fair amount of money. It's not crumbs.
Well, part of the problem too is that, moderate income people, you pay a certain number of dollars in taxes, but high income earners, they pay $50,000, $100,000 in taxes. You can't cut my taxes by $20,000. I don't pay that much. Yep. So there we go. And some of these things I think are on the news quite a bit. I just watch whichever network's more likely to show a photo of Stormy Daniels. But other than that, we're going to be right back in just a moment. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks here, along with co-host Carl Peterjohn and our Congressman Ron Estes. So this spring, the Federal Aviation Administration is up for reauthorization, and Congressman Estes spoke on the floor to introduce an amendment. We're going to show some video of that, and then we'll come back and ask him to explain what that amendment does.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today to propose amendment to Section 232 of H.R. 4, the FAA Reauthorization Act. As a representative of the 4th District of Kansas, which includes Wichita, also known as the air capital of the world, I have a deep appreciation for the importance of the aviation industry in our region and country. For more than 100 years, our community has pioneered aviation and manufacturing. Today, the greater Wichita area is home to many of the world's largest aviation manufacturers and produces nearly 50% of all general aviation planes built. Without question, aviation is a great source of pride for all Kansans, and I want to thank Chairman Schuster and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for their efforts to support the industry and modernize the FAA. As part of the FAA reauthorization of 2018, Congress has tasked the FAA administrator to establish a task force on flight standards reform. I believe creating this task force to improve aviation safety standards is a needed and overdue initiative. H.R. 4 will be comprised of representatives from air carriers, general and business aviation, repair stations,
Gentleman is recognized.
Unmanned aviation systems, flight schools, and aviation safety inspectors. Today, I'm offering an amendment to the task force to also include representatives of aircraft manufacturers. I believe those responsible for producing our nation's aircraft can play a valuable role in updating aviation safety standards and should have a voice. I want to thank our colleagues for their attention to the industry and consideration of this amendment and to support the FAA Reauthorization Act. I yield back.
Okay, so that was Congressman Ron Estes on the floor of the House of Representatives introducing an amendment. What was that amendment going to do, Representative Estes?
So basically part of the FAA reauthorization was to create this task force for flight standards. And it was going to be made up of representatives from the airline industry, from general aviation, from the unions, and we wanted to make sure that the manufacturers were included as representatives in that task force. Obviously here in Wichita, we have a huge footprint of aircraft manufacturers, whether it's the Spirit or the Cessna and Beechcraft and Learjet, but also just the suppliers for that. So there's a different dynamic from the manufacturing environment of making sure that some of the issues get addressed. One of the things in particular, bringing in either certification for a new plane or for new components to add to the plane. That process takes a long time now.
Oh, it must be very expensive too.
It is, and obviously we want the planes to be safe. We want the components to be safe and work efficiently, but we want to make sure that we have that manufacturing input into that discussion of how can we make flight standards more efficient and effective and make that better for our flying public.
What's the chance that this will make it through the Senate? Because it seems like the House passes an awful lot of legislation, and then we never hear about it again because it never gets out of the U.S. Senate.
Let me back up. I mean, the overall bill passed, but your amendment was part of what passed. Is that right?
My amendment was part. The FAA authorization bill has passed the House. That passed it last Thursday, and
by a huge margin.
A huge margin, yes. There was. I believe this is going to pass the Senate. I mean, you made reference to things that haven't gotten through the Senate. We've passed over 500 bills through the House this year, and over 480 of them are waiting on Senate process. And you might think that, well, that's just because it's Republican bills, and so the Democrats in the Senate are blocking that. But over half of those 480 bills were passed by a unanimous voice vote. So it's not like there's huge partisan bills in there. It's just getting that process through the Senate.
Or even some of these, like the renaming a post office bill and stuff that they won't act upon.
Right. It's just slow. Even some of the minor things that are just the normal function, day-to-day function of federal government is slow. But the FAA reauthorization is going to work its way through the Senate. I know the Senate's been working on this bill in particular for a long time. There's been a lot of discussion back and forth between the two chambers about how to make it work. And in fact, it had been held up for an extended period of time. And part of that was because originally there was some look at taking the air traffic control system out of the control of Congress and the legislative process and putting it into a quasi-government agency. They were calling it a privatization, but really it was creating a separate board for...
like the FCC?
Sort of like the FCC or the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. But the board would be mainly controlled by the airlines and the airline unions. There was going to be one general aviation representative on it. But our big concern about that was that the general aviation population would be squeezed out, that they wouldn't get landing slots. They'd get nickel and dime to death in being able to take off from airports and be held on the ground if they wanted to take off in order to let all the larger airlines take off, or just as a general nuisance. And that's critical for our general aviation community, both our manufacturers who make those planes, but also our businesses that use them. You can't have a headquarters in Wichita and a plant in Goodland and be able to get there on a very quick basis, or a plant out of state. And so we need to support that general aviation community. And through the work of a lot of us on the House side, we made sure that provision got pulled out of the FAA reauthorization. So the air traffic control is going to stay under the responsibility and control of Congress.
I think a lot of people don't understand that. Of course, commercial aviation, we're talking about United and Delta, all those people we know about. General aviation, we sometimes think, well, that's just a hobbyist flyer, but it's really businesses flying aircraft for their own purposes. Business travel.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a general big umbrella under the general aviation moniker. It could be somebody who's just a hobbyist, as you said, that just likes to fly and goes out and flies. Could be a doctor that likes to travel to see either see patients or see family members. It could be a business owner, and in all of those situations, there's value in that process. I mean, the general aviation owners and operators, they support the economy. They support controlling the air traffic, or the cost for the air traffic control system by paying a tax on fuel that they use for flying their planes. So it makes sure that the system runs efficiently and effectively. And it's a whole lot better than, for example, in Canada, you get a bill for separate things. So you get a bill for landing, you get a bill for calling the tower to take off, you get a bill for taking off. they all don't come at one time. So if you make a trip up there, you may get bills for several months afterwards. Granted, none of them are huge, maybe $20, $50, but they add up, and you don't know for sure what the basis of where they're coming from.
Interesting. Well, let's take our last commercial break for today. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back again to our final segment of Wichita Liberty TV for today. Bob Weeks here, co-host Carl Peter John, and our guest, United States Congressman Ron Estes of the 4th District of Kansas. So, the FAA bill reauthorized once every so-and-so years. We also have a farm bill that's reauthorized every 5 years. And in conjunction of that, you have something called the HOPE Act that's going to provide, if it passes, some reform to some of those areas. Could you explain, please?
Well, we introduced the HOPE Act, which basically the provisions and the whole concept behind that is that for individuals who are able to work, that if they're receiving public assistance, they ought to work. And our thought process there is, if you're between the ages of 18 and 59, if you have the ability, you don't have any disability, you're not a mother with small children, the expectation is you ought to have some work provisions. So we introduced the HOPE Act. It's been done here in Kansas with TANF in terms of having some work requirements tied to that. So we want to make sure that that's also done with the food stamp process and the rules around food stamps. So it's been good that it's been included in the Farm Bill because we call it the Farm Bill, but really it should be the Farm and Food Stamp Bill because 80% of the cost comes from the food stamp process. And so those provisions are put in there.
Congressman, let me ask you, in terms of specific legislation, I've heard a lot of concern from folks about the budget overall and the budget that was just passed. President Trump has said he won't sign another budget like the one that was just approved that dramatically increased federal spending. How do we avoid playing the same budgetary games that Washington's been playing with the 2018 budget for next year?
Yeah. See, one of the things that we talked about with that last omnibus that came through is that really only addresses a third of the spending of the federal government. That 1.3 trillion just addresses the defense and the non-defense discretionary spending. What's not being addressed is the 2/3 of the budget that deals with entitlement programs and the quasi-entitlement programs. And
so this is largely Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid to a smaller extent.
So in the entitlement programs I talk about are food stamps, the temporary assistance for needy families, the WIC programs, other things that are based off income. Social Security and Medicare are two programs that I use the term quasi-entitlements because we do contribute to those while we're working. Problem is we're not contributing enough for the amount that we take out when we do retire. And so we've got to address those. It'll be a different avenue that you have to address from that standpoint. But right now we're working with the Farm Bill on the entitlements related to food stamps, which is purely driven off of your income based. And we want to make sure that we have provisions when you're of working age and that you're capable of going to work, that you're actually, and it's not a big burden. It's at 20 hours of work a week, or actually working, getting some education, some work-related education would qualify for that as well. So if you need to be able to get some skills so that you can be working, and we know that it helps everybody's self-esteem to have a job, to actually help care for themselves and their family. And we want to help encourage that. We want to support that, look at ways to help make that work for all Americans.
Mm-hmm. About entitlements in general, I think the president campaigned that we're not going to reform Social Security and Medicare and things like that. And I think he's he's confirmed that even more recently. So, but I think most economists agree that we have to do something. What do you think the hope for changing the president's mind is?
We have to do something. And I think we could do something as simple as what we did in the 1980s, with the Greenspan Commission. So if you think back, retirement age for Social Security used to be 65. Now it's almost 67, because what the provisions that were put in 2000 in the 1980s was that gradually, starting with the folks that were under 50, your retirement age would move up by 2 months every year. So it didn't affect the people that were retired or the people that were close to retirement, but it affected people into the future. And so, my retirement age is going to be, 66 years and I don't know, 6 or 7 months before I could get full Social Security. So we need to go back and look at that. Social Security, when it was introduced, and 65 was set as the retirement age, that was back when life expectancy was 63. So we need to make sure that we kind of keep up with that and look at the future now that retirement age, or now that life expectancy's up in the 70s. And so I think that's a process that we can start. And I know from a presidential standpoint, you've got to start prioritizing what you do first. And obviously, we started with regulatory reform and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Ideally, we would have repealed and replaced Obamacare. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like much is going to be done in that regards because they can't get much passed through the Senate. But as we continue to work through some of these reauthorizations, we've got to come back to not just the entitlements like we're talking about in the Farm Bill, but also some of those quasi-retirements, looking at, and I think Social Security is one of those things that we can do to preserve and protect it. Because if we don't, by 2040, I forget the year exactly, it varies each year depending on how good the economy is, but approximately year 2040, we will only take in 75 cents on the dollar for every dollar that's been promised. So either we raise taxes or people on Social Security get a 25% cut, and I don't want to see that.
Yeah. Okay, well, Congressman Estes, we are out of time for today, so thanks so much for stopping in. Thank you to Carl for your input, and thank you to you, the viewers, for watching today, and we'll be back again next week.